If that woman gets $1, I'll tear this entire will apart, my son said, loud enough for every person in the room to hear, and in that moment, something inside me didn't break, it settled. The attorney's office was quiet before that, the kind of quiet that feels respectful, almost sacred, with soft carpet underfoot and the faint smell of polished wood lingering in the air, the kind of place where voices are supposed to stay low and measured, especially on a day like this, a day that marked the end of my husband's life and the beginning of whatever came after, and yet Daniel's voice cut through it like it didn't belong there at all, sharp, impatient, entitled. I could feel every pair of eyes shift toward me, not with sympathy, but curiosity, as if they were waiting to see how I would react, how the old woman would handle being called a shrew in a room full of people who had known my husband, some of them for decades. I didn't look at them, I didn't look at Daniel either. Instead I adjusted the cuff of my sleeve, smoothing a wrinkle that didn't really exist, a small, precise movement that gave my hands something to do, something steady, because steadiness was the only thing I was willing to give them. Chloe sat beside him, her posture perfectly composed, her lips pressed together in a thin line that might have passed for discomfort if you didn't know her as well as I did, but I had learned to read the spaces between her expressions, the slight tilt of her chin, the way her eyes never quite softened when they landed on me, and now they flickered, just briefly, not with shock, but with something closer to anticipation, as if this moment had already played out in her mind long before we ever sat down in these chairs. I could feel the weight of the room pressing in, the expectation that I would defend myself, that I would argue, that I would remind my son who I was and what I had done for this family, but I had no interest in performing for them, not today, not anymore. Grief has a way of stripping things down to their truth, and the truth was, I had spent years believing that patience and quiet endurance were enough to hold a family together, that if I gave enough, loved enough, stayed silent through enough small cuts, everything would remain intact. But sitting there, listening to my own son speak about me as if I were an inconvenience to be removed, I realized something far simpler, far colder. There are moments when silence is not weakness, but timing, and timing, when chosen carefully, can change everything. I lifted my gaze then, not toward Daniel, but toward the attorney, Mr. Collins, who had paused mid-sentence, his glasses lowered slightly as he assessed the room, waiting, perhaps, for the inevitable escalation. I met his eyes for just a second, long enough for him to see that I wasn't going to give them what they expected. Then I offered a small, almost polite nod, the kind you might give at a dinner table when someone is taking too long to pass the salt. Please, I said, my voice even, unhurried, go on, and for the first time since we'd sat down, the room didn't feel like it belonged to Daniel anymore. It shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but enough for me to know that whatever he thought he was taking from me today, he didn't understand the full shape of it yet, and that was fine, because understanding has never been a requirement for consequences to arrive. Mr. Collins cleared his throat softly, the sound almost too careful, as if he were stepping onto thin ice, and then he adjusted the stack of papers in front of him, aligning the edges with a precision that felt deliberate, grounding. As stated in the last will and testament of Mr. Edward Whitmore, he began, his voice measured and professional, the kind of voice that does not rush and does not tremble, no matter who is listening. I folded my hands in my lap and focused on the cadence of his words rather than their meaning, at least at first, because meaning has a way of unfolding on its own when you give it time, and time was something I had learned to respect. Daniel shifted in his seat beside Chloe, the faint creak of leather from his chair breaking through the stillness, impatience radiating off him in small, restless movements, the tapping of his finger against his knee, the way he exhaled through his nose as though every second that did not belong to him was a personal inconvenience. Chloe, on the other hand, had gone very still, her back straight, her chin slightly lifted, her attention fixed on the document in Mr. Collins's hands with a focus that seemed almost rehearsed. I did not need to look directly at her to know that she was listening for something specific, waiting for a particular phrase, a number, a confirmation of what she believed was already decided. It struck me then how different silence can feel depending on who is holding it. For Daniel, silence was a gap to be filled, something uncomfortable, something to push against, but for me, it had become a place to stand, a place where I could observe without being seen too clearly, without giving away the thoughts that were beginning to settle into something firmer, something colder. Mr. Collins continued reading, outlining the distribution of personal effects, charitable donations, smaller bequests to extended family members, each item delivered with the same calm neutrality, as if they were simply entries in a ledger rather than fragments of a life that had once been shared. I felt the familiar ache at the mention of Edward's name, not sharp, not overwhelming, but steady, like a bruise that had not yet faded. And for a brief moment, I allowed myself to remember the way he used to sit at our kitchen table early in the morning, a cup of coffee in his hand, the newspaper folded neatly beside him, the quiet companionship of those moments standing in stark contrast to the room I was in now, where everything felt formal and distant, even grief. The primary residence, Mr. Collins said, and I could feel the shift before he even finished the sentence. Daniel straightened, Chloe's eyes sharpened. The air itself seemed to tighten, expectation drawing a thin line through the room. I kept my gaze forward, my posture unchanged, as if this were just another line among many, just another detail in a long list. But inside, I noted the change, the way anticipation reveals more about a person than words ever could. Mr. Collins paused briefly, just long enough to turn a page, the soft rustle of paper sounding louder than it should have, and in that pause, I became aware of something else, something subtle but unmistakable, the sense that this moment, this exact sequence of seconds, was not unfolding the way Daniel expected it to, not yet, and perhaps not at all. I did not smile, not outwardly. But there was a quiet steadiness settling deeper within me, the kind that does not need to announce itself to be real. I had spent years believing that control belonged to the loudest voice in the room, the one willing to interrupt, to demand, to declare, but sitting there, listening, watching, I understood something different. Control often belongs to the person who can wait the longest, who can hold their ground without needing to prove it, and as Mr. Collins resumed reading, his voice unwavering, I realized that for the first time in a very long while, I was no longer reacting to what my family chose to do. I was simply allowing it to unfold, knowing that not every outcome needs to be forced in order to arrive exactly where it was always meant to go. The pause lingered just long enough to feel intentional, and then Mr. Collins continued, his tone unchanged, as if the tension gathering in the room had no bearing on the words he was about to deliver. The primary residence, located on West Elm Street, is to remain under the ownership of Margaret Whitmore, he said, and for a brief second, there was no reaction at all, not from Daniel, not from Chloe, not even from the distant relatives seated along the wall. It was as if the sentence had not fully landed yet, as if it needed a moment to settle into place before it could be understood, and then I heard it, the sharp intake of breath beside me, followed by the scrape of Daniel's chair as he leaned forward, his composure cracking not in a loud outburst this time, but in something tighter, more controlled, more dangerous in its restraint. That cannot be right, he said, his voice lower now but no less firm, as though volume had been replaced with certainty. Chloe turned her head slightly toward him, her expression shifting just enough to reveal the fracture beneath her calm, her eyes narrowing as she recalculated, as she tried to understand where the script had gone wrong. I remained still, my hands resting lightly against each other, my posture unchanged, because movement, even the smallest kind, would have suggested that this moment belonged to me, and it did not yet. Mr. Collins did not look up immediately. He simply turned another page, the quiet rustle sounding almost deliberate, and then he spoke again. There are additional provisions attached to this bequest, he said, and that was when the room truly changed, the air no longer tense with expectation, but with something closer to uncertainty, the kind that spreads slowly, settling into the spaces between people, making them aware that they are no longer in control of what comes next. Daniel let out a short breath that might have been a laugh on another day, but here it sounded hollow, forced. What provisions? He asked, and this time, there was an edge to it, a demand that had not yet been met. Chloe's fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her handbag, a small detail that might have gone unnoticed by anyone who was not looking for it, but I had learned to notice those things, the quiet signals that reveal more than words ever could. Mr. Collins adjusted his glasses, finally lifting his gaze just enough to acknowledge the room, but not enough to be drawn into it. Mr. Whitmore included a clause, he continued, one that addresses the conduct of any beneficiary during the execution of this will, and there it was, not the full truth, not yet, but enough to shift the ground beneath their feet. I felt the faintest echo of something I had not allowed myself to feel in a long time, not satisfaction, not quite, but recognition, the quiet understanding that Edward had seen more than he ever said, that he had noticed the same small fractures I had tried to smooth over for years, the same subtle shifts in tone, in respect, in the way I was spoken to and spoken about. Daniel leaned back slightly, confusion beginning to replace certainty. and Chloe's gaze flickered again, faster this time, sharper, as if she was searching for a way to regain control of something that was already slipping out of her reach. I did not look at either of them, because this moment did not require my acknowledgement to exist. It did not require my voice to validate it. All it required was time, and time, I had learned, has a way of revealing exactly what people have already shown you. If you are willing to see it clearly enough. Mr. Collins allowed the silence to stretch just a moment longer before continuing, as though even he understood that some words required space to be fully heard. This clause, he said, his voice steady and deliberate, was written to ensure that all beneficiaries conduct themselves with respect and decorum during the reading and execution of this will. Daniel let out a short, disbelieving breath, the kind that sits somewhere between a laugh and a protest, but he did not interrupt this time, not yet. Chloe's posture remained composed, but the tension had begun to show in smaller ways, in the way her shoulders held just a fraction too stiff, in the way her gaze no longer rested calmly but moved. Quick and calculating, searching for footing that was no longer there, I kept my eyes forward, not because I was avoiding them, but because I no longer needed to measure their reactions to understand them. I had spent years doing that, years learning the subtle language of pauses and glances, of what was said and what was carefully left unsaid, and now, in this quiet, I could see it all without turning my head. Mr. Collins turned another page, his fingers precise, unhurried. Any act of verbal disrespect, public humiliation, or conduct deemed intentionally degrading toward another named beneficiary, he continued, may result in the immediate forfeiture of the offending party's inheritance rights, as determined by the executor. The words settled into the room slowly, like dust in sunlight, visible only once it had already begun to fall, and for a moment, no one spoke, no one moved. It was as if the meaning needed time to find its way into each person's understanding. Daniel's jaw tightened first, a small, almost imperceptible shift, but one that carried weight. His confidence, which had filled the room only minutes earlier, now seemed to hesitate, as though it had reached a boundary it had not anticipated. That is vague, he said finally, his voice controlled but edged. What qualifies as disrespect? It was a question, but not a genuine one. It was a challenge, an attempt to regain control by questioning the rules themselves. Mr. Collins did not respond immediately. Instead he glanced briefly down at the document again, as if confirming something that had already been written long before any of us sat in this room. The determination, he said calmly, is left to the executor, based on observable conduct during this proceeding. And that was when Daniel turned his head, not toward the attorney, but toward me, his eyes searching, measuring, trying to read something in my expression that might give him clarity. But there was nothing there for him to find, not anger, not triumph, not even accusation, just stillness, the kind that does not offer answers. Chloe followed his gaze, her own expression sharpening as she watched me, as if she too were trying to locate the point where this moment had shifted away from them. I felt the weight of their attention without acknowledging it, because acknowledgement would have given them something to hold on to, something to push against, and I had no intention of giving them that. Instead I allowed the silence to remain intact, steady, unbroken, because silence, when held with intention, has a way of revealing more than any argument ever could, and in that silence, something became unmistakably clear, not just to me, but to everyone in that room. This was no longer a simple reading of a will, it was a line being drawn, one that had already been written long before today, one that did not require my voice to enforce it, only my patience to let it unfold exactly as it was meant to. Daniel did not speak right away, and that silence, coming from him, felt more revealing than anything he had said before. His eyes remained fixed on me, searching for a reaction that never came, as though he believed that if he looked long enough, he would find the answer hidden somewhere in my face. But there was nothing there for him to take, nothing he could twist or challenge, just the same calm stillness that had unsettled him from the very beginning. Chloe shifted beside him, this time unable to mask the movement, her fingers tightening again around her handbag, the leather creasing softly under the pressure, a small sound that seemed louder in the quiet room. This is ridiculous, she said finally, her voice controlled but carrying a sharpness that cut through the air. You cannot expect a single moment to determine something this important. Her words were directed toward Mr. Collins, but her gaze flickered back to me. At the end, quick and assessing, as if trying to measure whether I had anticipated this reaction, Mr. Collins did not appear surprised. He simply adjusted his glasses once more and folded his hands over the document. The clause does not rely on a single moment, he replied evenly. It reflects a pattern of conduct, but it may be triggered by behavior observed during this proceeding. The distinction was subtle, but it carried weight, and I could feel it settle into the room, changing the shape of the conversation in a way that could not easily be undone. Daniel leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly, as though he were attempting to regain control through restraint, but restraint, when it comes too late, often reveals more than it conceals. So you are saying, he began, his tone measured but strained, that anything said here can be used to disqualify someone. Mr. Collins inclined his head just slightly. I am saying that respect was a condition your father considered essential, he said, and he chose to formalize that expectation. At the mention of Edward, something shifted again, not in the room, but within me, a quiet memory surfacing without invitation. I could see him sitting at his desk late one evening, a single lamp casting a warm circle of light over scattered papers, his expression thoughtful, more serious than usual. I had asked him then if something was wrong, and he had only smiled, a small, reassuring smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Just making sure things are in order, he had said, and I had not pressed further, because trust, at that time, had felt natural, unquestioned. Now, sitting in that office, I understood that moment differently, not as distance, but as intention, as a decision made quietly, without confrontation, the same way he had handled most things that mattered. Daniel's gaze broke away from me at last, turning back toward the attorney, but the certainty that had once defined his posture was no longer there, replaced instead by something less stable, something uncertain. Chloe leaned slightly closer to him, her voice lowered, but not enough to be entirely private. Just stay calm, she murmured, though the tension in her tone suggested that calm was no longer something she fully possessed herself. I remained where I was, my hands still, my posture unchanged, because this moment did not require movement, it did not require defense or explanation, it required only what it had always required, patience. The kind that allows truth to unfold without interference, the kind that reveals not just what people say, but who they choose to be when they believe they are still in control. And as the silence settled once more, heavier now, more defined, it became clear that whatever Daniel and Chloe had expected from this day, it was already beginning to slip beyond their reach, not because I had taken anything from them, but because they had given something away long before they realized its value. Mr. Collins did not rush to fill the silence this time, and in that pause, something subtle but undeniable shifted in the room, the kind of shift that does not announce itself but can be felt in the way people hold their breath just a little longer, in the way posture changes without anyone quite realizing it. Daniel sat back further into his chair, his earlier certainty now replaced by a careful stillness, as if he had begun to understand that every word carried weight he could no longer afford to ignore. Chloe, however, was not as quick to adapt. Her composure, though still present on the surface, had begun to fracture in the small details, the tightening of her jaw, the slight narrowing of her eyes as she glanced between Mr. Collins and me, calculating, reassessing, searching for a path that no longer seemed as clear as it once had. There must be some kind of clarification, she said, her voice controlled, but no longer smooth, something that defines what qualifies as disrespect in a more objective way. It was not a question, but an attempt to reframe the situation, to pull it back into territory she could manage. But Mr. Collins only gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. The language was intentionally left broad, he replied, to allow for judgment based on context and intent, and there it was again, that quiet finality, not loud, not aggressive, but immovable, like a door that has already been locked long before anyone thought to reach for the handle. Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping briefly to the table before lifting again, this time not toward me, but toward the document itself, as though he might find something there that could restore what he believed he had lost. But documents do not offer comfort, they only reflect what has already been decided. I remained still, not out of restraint, but because there was nothing left to adjust, nothing left to prepare for. The moment had already begun to unfold exactly as it was meant to, and any movement from me now would have been unnecessary, almost intrusive, like speaking during a quiet piece of music that is meant to be heard in full. So what happens next? Daniel asked, his voice lower now, more measured, stripped of the sharp edge it carried before, and for the first time, it sounded less like a demand and more like uncertainty. Mr. Collins glanced down at the document once more, his fingers resting lightly against the page as if grounding himself in the certainty of what was written there. We proceed, he said simply, and that simplicity carried more weight than any long explanation could have, because it meant that nothing had been derailed, nothing had been paused or reconsidered. Everything was continuing exactly as intended. Chloe shifted again, this time leaning slightly forward, her focus sharpening as if she were preparing for something, though it was no longer clear whether she knew what that something would be. I could feel their attention returning to the process, not to me, not directly, but to the unfolding sequence that no longer belonged to them, and in that shift, I recognized something that had taken me years to understand. Control is often mistaken for power, but true power rarely needs to assert itself, it simply exists, steady and unshaken, waiting for the right moment to become visible. And as Mr. Collins prepared to continue, the room settling once more into a quiet that felt different now, heavier, more defined, I realized that whatever came next would not need to be forced, it would arrive on its own, carried forward by the very choices that had already been made. Long before any of us walked into this room, Mr. Collins drew in a quiet breath before continuing, and this time, when he spoke, there was a subtle shift in his tone, not louder, not sharper, but more deliberate, as if each word had been placed carefully long before it was ever spoken aloud. In accordance with the clause outlined, he said, "The executor is required to evaluate any conduct displayed during this proceeding." Daniel straightened slightly, his attention locking onto every syllable now, no longer impatient, but alert, the way a person becomes when they realize the outcome is no longer predictable. Chloe leaned forward just enough to show that she was no longer observing, she was bracing, her earlier composure replaced by a focused tension that settled into her posture. I remained still, my gaze steady, not because I needed to appear unaffected, but because I truly was. There was nothing left for me to anticipate, nothing left to prepare for, only the continuation of something that had already begun long before today. Based on the conduct observed thus far, Mr. Collins continued, and the room seemed to narrow around those words, as if everything else had been temporarily set aside. A determination must be made regarding eligibility to inherit under the conditions set forth by Mr. Whitmore. Daniel's jaw tightened again, but this time he said nothing, the silence from him no longer confident, but cautious, as though he understood that speaking now carried a cost he could not yet measure. Chloe's eyes flickered briefly toward him, a silent exchange passing between them, quick and strained, the kind of communication that does not rely on words, but reveals everything in its urgency. I noticed it without turning my head, without shifting my posture, because by now, I did not need to look directly at them to understand what was happening. "It is my responsibility," Mr. Collins went on, "to determine whether any actions have violated the expectations explicitly stated in this document." He paused then, not for effect, but because the pause itself had become part of the process, a space where meaning could settle fully before moving forward. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his hands now clasped together, a change so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone who had not spent years watching him, years understanding how he carried himself when he believed he was in control, and how that posture shifted when he was not. "This is not fair," he said finally, his voice quieter now, less certain, the sharpness replaced by something closer to frustration, but even that felt restrained, as though he were choosing his words more carefully than before. Chloe did not speak this time, but the tension in her expression had deepened, her lips pressed together, her gaze fixed on Mr. Collins with an intensity that suggested she was already calculating what could be said next, what could still be salvaged. I felt a faint echo of something then, not triumph, not satisfaction, but clarity, the kind that arrives slowly and settles deeply, the realization that fairness had never been the foundation of what they expected, control had been, and now that control was no longer certain, everything else began to feel unstable. Mr. Collins lowered his gaze briefly to the document once more, his hand resting lightly against the page, grounding himself in the authority of what had been written. "Given the statements made at the beginning of this proceeding," he said, his voice calm, unwavering, "there is sufficient cause to consider those remarks in direct violation of the conduct clause." The words did not land with force. They did not need to, their weight came from their certainty, from the fact that they did not require interpretation to be understood. Daniel's head lifted slightly, his eyes widening just a fraction, not in shock, but in realization, the kind that arrives too late to be undone. Chloe's composure faltered for the first time in a way that could not be concealed, her shoulders tensing, her gaze shifting rapidly as if searching for something that was no longer there. I did not move, I did not speak. Because this moment did not belong to me, it belonged to the truth they had already revealed themselves, and as the silence settled once more, deeper now, more final, it became clear that what was unfolding was not a sudden change, not an unexpected turn. but the natural result of everything that had already been said and done. Long before anyone thought to consider the consequences, the words did not echo. They settled, heavy and undeniable, and for a moment, no one moved. As if the entire room had been placed on pause, Daniel blinked once, slowly, as though trying to process something that refused to align with what he had expected. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. The confidence that had once driven his voice now replaced by hesitation, by the unfamiliar weight of consequence. "You cannot be serious," he said finally. But even that lacked the force it once would have carried. It sounded thinner now, stretched by uncertainty. Chloe reacted differently, quicker, sharper, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the urgency beneath it. "This is being taken out of context," she said, leaning forward, her voice controlled but no longer smooth. "People say things in moments like this, emotions are high. That does not mean." She stopped herself, not because she had finished, but because she realized that explanation, in this room, held no authority. Mr. Collins did not interrupt her. He did not argue. He simply waited, allowing her words to settle into the same silence that had already begun to define the space, and in that silence, her argument seemed to lose shape, as if it required resistance to remain intact. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. A gesture I had not seen from him in years, one that belonged to a younger version of him, one who had not yet learned to mask discomfort with control. "There has to be a way to correct this," he said, his voice lower. Now, less certain, his eyes shifting briefly toward me before returning to the attorney. But I did not respond, not with words, not with expression, because there was nothing to correct, nothing to clarify. Everything that needed to be understood had already been revealed. Mr. Collins adjusted the document slightly, his movements steady, unaffected by the tension that now filled the room. "The clause was designed precisely for this purpose," he said, "to ensure that respect is not treated as optional, but as a condition." The simplicity of the statement left no room for negotiation. Chloe exhaled sharply, her composure faltering further. "This is unreasonable," she said, though the conviction in her voice had begun to weaken, replaced by something closer to frustration, to disbelief. Daniel did not speak again right away, his gaze lowering to the table, his hands clasped together more tightly now, as if holding on to something that was already slipping away. I watched none of it directly, and yet I saw everything. The unraveling did not need to be observed to be understood. It was present in the air, in the shift of energy, in the way certainty had given way to doubt. I felt no satisfaction in it, only a quiet clarity. The kind that comes when something long unspoken finally takes form, when truth no longer needs to be hinted at or carefully avoided. It simply exists, undeniable, complete, based on the statements made. Mr. Collins continued, his voice unchanged. "It is my determination that Daniel Whitmore has violated the conduct clause." The words were delivered without emphasis, without judgment, but their meaning carried its own finality. Daniel's head lifted sharply at that, his eyes widening just enough to reveal the impact. Not dramatic, not explosive, but real, deeply real. Chloe turned toward him immediately, her expression tightening, searching for something to say, something to undo what had already been set in motion. But there are moments when words arrive too late, when the outcome has already been shaped by what came before, and this was one of them. I remained still, my hands resting lightly together, my posture unchanged, because this moment did not require reaction. It required only acknowledgement, silent and complete, that what had been set into motion long ago had now reached its natural conclusion, not through force, not through confrontation, but through the quiet weight of consequence finally finding its place. No one spoke after that. Not immediately, and the silence that followed did not feel empty, it felt complete, as if everything that needed to be said had already found its place. Daniel remained still for a moment longer, his eyes fixed somewhere ahead but not truly focused, as though he were trying to hold onto a version of this moment that no longer existed. Then he let out a slow breath, the kind that carries realization with it, quiet but heavy. "So that is it," he said, though it did not sound like a question. Chloe turned toward him again, her expression tight, searching, as if she expected him to push back, to argue, to reclaim something that had slipped away. But he did not this time. The room itself seemed to wait, but there was nothing left to interrupt. Mr. Collins lowered the document slightly, his posture unchanged, his role fulfilled without the need for emphasis or conclusion. I allowed a small moment to pass before I moved, not because I needed time, but because time had already done its work. I placed my hands gently against the arms of the chair and stood, the movement slow, deliberate, steady. The kind of movement that does not ask for attention but receives it anyway. I could feel their eyes shift again, following me now, not with curiosity as before, but with something quieter, something more uncertain. I adjusted my coat, smoothing the fabric as I had done earlier, a small gesture, familiar, grounding. I did not look at Daniel right away, and when I finally did, it was only for a second, long enough to see the change, not dramatic, not sudden, but real, the absence of certainty where it had once been, the understanding that something had been lost not in this room, but long before it. I did not speak to him, there was nothing left that required words. Chloe remained seated, her posture still composed on the surface, but the tension in her hands, in the way her fingers pressed against each other, revealed what she could not hide. I turned slightly toward Mr. Collins and gave a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement, not of victory, but of completion. Then I stepped away from the chair, the soft sound of my shoes against the carpet barely audible, yet distinct enough to mark the end of something that had stretched far beyond this single afternoon. As I moved toward the door, I did not hurry, I did not hesitate, because neither was necessary. The outcome did not need to be emphasized, it simply existed, steady and undeniable. I reached for the handle, pausing only briefly, not to look back, but to allow the moment to settle fully, to let everything that had unfolded find its place without interference, and then I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, where the air felt different, lighter, not because anything had been gained, but because something had finally been understood. And as the door closed softly behind me, I realized that I did not need to fight for respect. I only needed to stop ignoring when it was no longer there, because in the end, it was never something they could take from me, only something I could choose to walk away with.